Today, we sat down with Sayer G., founder of greenmedinfo.com, the largest library of natural medicine on the planet, and author of Regenerate. It was an exciting conversation. He has a lot to say about what's currently going on in our nation as it relates to causes of autism being uncovered, as it relates to dark sides of psychiatry being uncovered, and ultimately what we can do about it going forward.
Yeah, we really got into the Tylenol autism thing too, and dove deeply into causes of autism. And there's certainly more than one, and certainly have been indexed in greenmedinfo.com. And he gets into that. And I think you're going to love this episode that we just did with Sayer G. Well, the Wall Street Journal came out and said that you played a role in President Trump's Tylenol announcement. And I'm anxious to hear what that was all about from your perspective.
Well, it's an interesting sort of news cycle around that because I simply found out myself from reporters that, RFK Jr. sent my Substack article on Tylenol reviewing the research, which largely was based on William Parker, PhD's work over years, looking at the association between, ADHD and autism with Tylenol, and which we think is a causal relationship. And he sent it to the Kenvue CEO following a meeting he had with him, which of course was based on HHS had signaled Tylenol is going to be an issue that they're going to address. And then the stock crashed. And then I guess Kenvue's CEO made it a point to meet with Bobby and probably convey their side of the story, which is of course denying it, safe and effective, etc. So so I heard about it through two reporters that reached out to me from The Atlantic and then, of course, Wall Street Journal. But it just goes to show you in this information age, where do you get trustworthy information? A lot of the folks that were deplatformed ended up on Substack, and where we're referencing, in some cases, hundreds of studies. They're basically recycling, pharma talking points around their products having no risk, even though the weight of evidence is so clearly showing there is.
Okay.
So it didn't surprise me that happened, but the mainstream media is now acknowledging, okay, this sort of information is getting out.
Were you surprised that it was Tylenol? That was the thing that they first started with?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, because, Green Med Info has 10,000 topics, and I was uniquely really just set up for this because at 12 years of age, I did my first report in elementary school on Tylenol's liver toxicity because my father, who's a Rutgers professor, he focused on this for his research. So I just happened to have known about it when that's 41 years ago. Is it? Oh my Lord. So, it's not like I'm new to this advocacy on Tylenol, but yes, it is a little strange because obviously there are other things that are more controversial, like vaccines.
Well, with Tylenol, is it the acetaminophen that also causes the liver toxicity, or is it something else in Tylenol? Or is acetaminophen basically to blame for everything?
No, there's definitely like an oxidative burst that happens, and there is a particular molecule, NQPI, which we believe, based on the research and the plausible mechanisms, is enhancing, the oxidative stress that may already be present in the body. It could be from, aluminum adjuvants in vaccines, or, it could even be a cytokine storm from a so-called infection, depending on how you look at, explanations around germ theory and infectious disease. So it's sort of a perfect storm because, of course, many parents, they're told by their pediatrician, hey, post-vaccination, there could be a spike in temperature, or even just through natural processes, we're told fever, even though it's the body's mechanism of clearing a so-called infection. And so that forces, in many ways, parents to fall prey to the marketing strategies of, Kenvue's a J&J subsidiary, the bright red advertising with the, child being lovingly taken care of by the parent, just give them Tylenol, right? When it's the worst possible moment, you don't need Tylenol, as an antipyretic. In fact, there are probably 100 different natural ways to do it. And there is evidence to share on that. We even have a bunch of it on Green Med Info. One old method was, you can find this on Earth Clinic because anecdotal traditional approaches are profound, but they would take a raw egg, put it into a sock in the feet, and it just seems to work so well. No one knows why, but it is interesting that influenza is incubated in avian cells, and sometimes it's used in the form of egg as a medium. So there's probably some explanation for why it works.
When you said egg in the sock works, are you saying to help the body to reduce the fever, or does it work more of in a synergistic way to not fight against the fever?
I think it's probably both because, obviously you want to encourage a fever. You get under a blanket. They used to give children like hot toddies even, to raise the temperature. And that's the way of the body resetting. It has to reach a peak state of theoretically liquefaction of the easy water in cells to excrete toxicants. That's one explanation that Dr. Cowan goes into, which I think is actually quite brilliant. So the last thing you want to do is interfere with a fever,
Mm.
because that absolutely can result in, chronic conditions. Even in conventional germ theory, surreptitious, adventitious viruses persist, slow viruses, because you haven't been able to raise the temperature high enough and clear the body through conventional symptoms of influenza and cold, which are actually there to heal you. But of course, in the allopathic model, which also co-ops, this natural process. It says, "Oh my Lord, this is ground zero of the next pandemic. Let's lock down your family and your town and your country." I mean, it's so hyperbolic, the extreme distortion and abuse of our body's natural processes as a geopolitical weapon,
Right,
essentially,
right.
which we all experienced thanks to the COVID-19 lockdowns, right? That was an absurd and wrongful way to go about addressing so-called infectious disease, in my opinion.
Yeah, and so many people woke up during that, which we're so thankful for. Trump mentioned recently that there's zero substitute for Tylenol. I don't know if you saw that statement, but so obviously
Yeah.
you disagree with that statement then.
Yeah, I mean, I even allow for the possibility that certain allopathic interventions can be life-saving. Maybe 1 in a billion cases even. I don't go to extremes really, even though, of course, we've all been characterized in this manner.
Mhm.
Standing up for parental rights makes you some kind of far-right Nazi, according to the rhetoric that they've been promulgating. But essentially, yeah, I'd say in most cases, that statement is absolutely absurd and anti-scientific, extremely irresponsible, meaning that like Tylenol actually has a place in perinatal health, and that somehow it should be used to address a quote fever. I mean, that's actually what Kenvue decided they would do, is in rebutting, the so-called, sort of like refusal of HHS to make room for Tylenol initially. They claimed that somehow a deficiency of Tylenol. Okay, this was actually the Wall Street Journal article where they mentioned the text and everything. Was that somehow that would be irresponsible because so many women would end up with high fevers, and then of course that would increase autism. So they spun it so that Tylenol deficiency could contribute somehow to increased autism. I mean, that's literally what they tried to do with this.
I mean, it's such a savior mentality of medicine that without this specific medicine, I mean, think about women who, what you're saying, the natural process of pregnancy and safe pregnancy and birth would not exist outside this pharmaceutical intervention. It's just amazing that people embrace this savior mentality that, oh, without access, and we've been birthing for thousands of years, like, and suddenly we need Tylenol. But you know what? We were in the ER with MJ. She had her first ER visit. I don't think I told you this, but she split her head open,
Oh,
and when they were going to sew her up, they said, first we're going to give her a Tylenol so that we can see if she can keep anything down to make sure there wasn't cranial damage or head trauma.
oh
And
my.
Nick looked at him and said, she's never had a Tylenol in her life. We're not going to do that. And they said, oh, okay, never mind. So then they just
Uh,
moved on with the procedure. So it wasn't like, oh, then we should try applesauce or we should
mm,
try Sprite, like no other
yeah.
offerings, just Tylenol or bust to see if she can keep something down. And I wonder,
Wow.
after this announcement that calls out this medical intervention as consequential, if those types of processes will change in a pediatric ER settings. I mean, we were in the children's ER. It's just fascinating that it's not seen as consequential to use Tylenol with kids.
Yeah. Well, the standard of care in the conventional medical model is like a legal obligation to those who are within that system. So, in many ways, a lot of healthcare professionals today are glorified applied pharmacologists. It's not like they're really practicing anything that even resembles the term health care. It's really, you dispense this product at this time, and if you don't, then you're liable potentially for a lawsuit. Even an unwitting victim, so-called patient, might sue that doctor or nurse for not giving them the poison that they think they need. So it is a very complex situation. I do have empathy for those on the other side.
Well, I also am worried about their jobs with AI. Protocol driven medicine and AI, man, that seems to be the easiest, not to go on a side note here, but that seems to be the easiest thing to, to reproduce with AI.
That's a really good point. And when the so-called, cyberborg, the AI modeled after Fauci's protocols and view of health starts to be deployed at scale, and no one can deviate from that model. That's sort of what we're looking at this point. So yeah, we live in very strange and dangerous times, I'd say.
And that's why I think Trump's announcement and Secretary Kennedy's announcement about Tylenol was so significant, because it showed dissent within medicine. I mean, can we just stop saying that there's consensus-based medicine, that there's one size fits all, that we all agree, when now it's out in the open in the mainstream that there are dissenting views? So it's just, I think that's the biggest win of the day, regardless of exposing Tylenol, which is huge because, I remember sitting in my law office one day, and one of my fellow mother attorneys walks in and says, "Yeah, I just had to run home and give my teething baby a Tylenol. I just can't stand to see her uncomfortable." And so I just share with her, well, you do realize that the fever is a good thing, and that if you drive down the fever, the body might work too hard to jump over that set point, and it causes, and I think that's research that Nick had brought to me when we first had kids from Green Med Info, was about the set point. And that's one of the most convicting things to me as a mother is I am not going to mess with that fever, because then it could get artificially high because we've messed with it, so.
Yeah. Well, there are cases too where, naturally speaking, seizure does happen, when there is a so-called infection. And that's actually kind of common. I think it's over 1% of all, infants will experience that sort of thing. So it does make it confusing and scary, because it's pretty horrific when it happens, even naturally. That said, I think what you pointed out earlier is profound, which is heterodoxy, or having different views in medicine in the Biden era was actually equated to a form of domestic terrorism. And that's through DHS memos, and that's all now very clearly documented. In fact, Tulsi Gabbard will be coming out with some declassified documents on how they did this. So it's such an extreme reality we just emerged from, to now have our own president and, of course, Bobby, representing the voices of the voiceless, both the gaslit parents as well as the millions of children who obviously couldn't even speak yet, who are literally, succumbing to, I would say, it's a meteor-like event when it comes to health for children, like in terms of like devastation of the neurological basis for what it means to be human, to even be conscious. This is an agenda that has been so dark and multi-generational that we're suddenly seeing light, come through. And it's just so profound. It's just beautiful, actually.
Well, and I know when he came out with the announcement that many in our circles were upset that vaccines weren't more heavily emphasized. And to your knowledge, have they done studies to separate vaccines and Tylenol? Like, do we have any data on how many of the children that were damaged by acetaminophen, as an example, did not receive the infant schedule? Like, I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, my understanding is that there is no research right now on that most obvious question that needs to be answered. And the reason why there's no research on that topic, it's the same exact reason why there is no saline placebo control trial of any vaccine in today's schedule, and why there are no synergistic studies on multiple vaccines, certainly not compared to placebos, is because they know the truth is that if they were to do those studies, it would clearly show profound associations. And, you know, well, actually, you know what? There is a study that was done on regressive autism with Tylenol. And regressive autism is the most clear example of you have a healthy infant or child, they get a vaccine, and within a matter of days, they start to regress and they never come back. And Tylenol showed up to 20, it was up to 20-fold increase rate of regressive autism in certain, populations. So there may actually, I'm going to check with William Parker on this, but it's a great question. And there should be many studies on that topic.
Well, and with those kids, I wonder how many of them had received the childhood schedule, so
Yeah.
as a tipping point or as the cup overflows, is which thing was the tipping point? And I know the Mawson and Hooker study showed that what autism rates were 4 times higher in vaccinated cohorts, and I just wonder how that interplays with the acetaminophen exposure.
It might
That's a,
be that the trigger, Sayer, because when you look at death reports from the CDC, historically, before COVID, they looked at precipitating events. Like, was this a heart failure patient? Not they got a
yeah,
flu and died, but like, you know what I mean? So, but then most recently, they're putting after COVID, they'll say like COVID was the cause of death, regardless of any
yeah,
comorbidities. So it's almost
yeah.
like that's what we're looking at with this Tylenol is that Tylenol is the necessary trigger for
Mhm.
autism, but the vaccines could very well be the precipitating event.
Wow. Yeah.
It's just, I don't
Well,
know. Or the pregnancy schedule. How does that factor in to Tylenol and
right.
mother?
Well, the main issue, which William Parker, PhD, and Brian Hooker, PhD, brought to my attention, is that the pregnant women actually are filtering, the blood of the fetus, and so technically, it's actually that is a good thing. Okay, an infant doesn't have that, and so once the placenta's gone, they're just on their own. And that's the problem with Tylenol. They're like cats, essentially. Cats can't detoxify this chemical, and there's similar, very similar pathways involved. There's about 30 different lines of evidence showing that Tylenol is contributing to neurobiological destruction of those who receive it. And that's something that, again, the article that was sent to the Kenvue CEO goes into all that research. It's called Broken Trust. It's a 4-part series on my Substack about Tylenol, because the other main one I know that people are not aware of is a single dose of Tylenol will profoundly affect affect, will flatten affect, will cause numbing, will reduce, self-control. So risk taking, violence towards self and other are implicated. So it's essentially a psychiatric effect. And it makes sense. Think about it. You're numbing pain. Pain is a human experience. And for those who know what pain is, it's actually your greatest teacher. And it's essential for you in order to reach to the other side, which is relief. And that's the ecstatic nature of embodiment. You have to go through pain and pleasure, and you take away one pole and the other doesn't exist the way it should. And then suddenly you don't experience it's natural, neurobiologically, it's natural. Go through an intense workout. I know probably you guys
Mhm.
both do that. I mean, I remember my marathon. Oh my Lord. Talk about like excruciating. But once you're done, you feel such ecstasy. That's the whole point. So numbing pain has a profound effect on our humanity. And Tylenol is vicious. I mean, no one's talking about this. In fact, they're wanting to distract from that fact, but it should be banned for that reason alone.
Well, and the idea of numbing pain, it's not even just kids, it's for the general population. It's so easy just to say, well, I was just in a little bit of pain, so I took that. And whatever that
Yeah.
thing is, and it could be Tylenol, which is incredibly dangerous. It could be something else, but the idea of avoiding discomfort and just running
Mhm.
away from that, man, that has created such fragility just amongst as a humanity. This generation is extremely fragile because of that. And I tend to meet with our patients and people who say, I just popped in a whatever it is, ibuprofen, and it's like, was it really? Were you in that much pain? Like, first of all, were you in debilitating pain where you had to do that? It's like, no, typically not.
No, and it's unfortunate, but hyperalgesia or increased pain is caused by most of these interventions, especially the opioid category, which is what causes addiction. You take it, you get a sudden burst of like heroin-like relief, and then of course you went to heaven, now you're going to go to hell as a result. It has to balance out. And in those cases, it actually increases your sensitivity and experience of pain. That's clear. So the whole notion of pain killing, it's in the title itself. You're going to kill yourself with this
Mm.
intervention. And it's so conventionally allopathic, right? It's just so hidden in plain daylight. Mm.
That's such a good point. Painkiller, an antibiotic. I mean, just that's the allopathic trend line that you can follow really clearly. But there's a lot of people, moms and dads, who saw the announcement about the Tylenol in autism, and those with kids who are on the spectrum, and they're confused now and wondering what else might be possible as far as links of causations. Now, we mentioned vaccines, we mentioned Tylenol, but with your work with GreenMed Info, what other exposures have you indexed?
Thanks for asking that, because that's an essential topic. And in fact, when the reporters reached out to me on this topic, I tried to make it clear that for 20 years, we've been helping people to understand the multifactorial nature of autism. And to your earlier point, Leah, this announcement was so profound that there was even an acknowledgement of the environmental component of so-called disease and epidemic level diseases like autism that are scaling in a way that genetic causes cannot explain. So essentially, there's ultrasound. Prenatal ultrasound is unfortunately one of the worst because of the fact that it induces cavitation. In fact, that's why it's used to do things like, destroy kidneys, stones while they're in your body.
What does
These are
cavitation mean?
Cavitation is essentially a nano or micro nuclear explosion. Like, it's essentially the same thing. In fact, like the pistol shrimp is a perfect example. It snaps its claw and induces essentially a mini supernova. And the temperatures reach 5,000 kelvins, which is about close to the surface of the sun, as estimated, because no one's ever been there that I know of who's measured it directly. But we're talking about just such an insane amount of energy that if it's happening while they're scanning essentially this piece of jelly, which is a fetus, the unintended adverse effects are just incalculable. So that's one major issue that is not being discussed, especially those who are doing like 10 and 20, and like it's like some recreational thing. You go in and you scan your baby over and over. It makes no sense at all when you know what water cavitation is and you look at the reviews on the research on this. So that's a major one. And believe it or not, glyphosate is a major cause. The gentleman, William Shaw, who I spoke with as well before writing my article, was the one who wrote about glyphosate being a major contributor to undermining the microbiome, which then contributes to all these cascading effects that unfortunately have dire neurobiological consequences. He's the one who observed that Cuba had up to 300 to 1,000 times lower rates of autism because it's a prescribed medication there. And so that's there are other confounding factors, but that one was a major red flag. So that's one example. Glyphosate is a pretty big one. And then of course, let's see, the major, this was supposedly debunked like so many safe and effective interventions. Pitocin, synthetic, right? Hormone, which is used to induce, labor, which basically creates an epigenetic modification of the receptors for oxytocin, which, as we know, for those on the spectrum, that connection that's mediated through oxytocin is reduced. Well, if you're getting a massive dose of that synthetically at the birth moment, when there's this cocktail of incredible hormones that enable you to start your first moment of life the right way, it's being basically oversaturated, the receptors. Of course, there's a compensatory mechanism to desensitize, because that could be a highly toxic, well, it is a highly toxic intervention. So Pitocin is another really big one that needs to be looked at again, inducing, even the notion of that you have to be on a timetable, often to fit the schedules of the OBYN gynecologist. So there's about probably 20 other ones, but those are major.
Well, I love that you're touching on, the birth component of this, because obviously when a child is rapidly developing, it makes sense that we would look at these things. But I remember you said something during my last pregnancy. You said, "Oh, it's not whether an ultrasound does harm, it's how much." And I was like, then that shouldn't be an option. You mean like, why are we doing this? And I lost my provider over it because I went to her and Nick and I had decided not to do ultrasound. And she said, "You do realize you're risking your child's brain, you're risking your child's heart, da da da." And I said, "You do realize that the research shows that ultrasound does not increase maternal or fetal outcomes in a healthy mom." And she was like, "Well, you still don't know if your child's going to have half a brain when it's born because you're not doing an ultrasound." I was like, "Okay, well, you have no place in this experience," because I just so badly want women to know that the natural birth experience with removing all of these stopgaps and potential huge harms is something so primal that men never get to experience. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
do you know
Yeah.
God? Like, this is an opportunity to work directly with Him. It's amazing. Like, don't forsake this
Yeah.
opportunity. But anyway, I digress. So the EPA told me we were in a meeting with them probably a month ago now, and their head of labeling said, "Leah, I'm so proud of our research on glyphosate because our standard is so high that we look at, would this be safe if we applied it to the grass and then the next minute an infant crawled out onto the grass?" And that's the standard we uphold at the EPA, is that an infant could crawl on the grass with freshly sprayed glyphosate. And you know why they believe this? Because their
Yeah.
research shows it
Oh
only
my.
kills plants and
Oh.
bacteria. It doesn't kill humans. It's a
Oh
side,
my.
but it only kills plants and bacteria.
Kills me.
So the
Well, I mean,
humans are
that's a
fine, right?
I mean, this is the chemical industry biased standard known as the weight of evidence standard versus the precautionary principle. Like, for example, there's very compelling cell research that in the parts per quadrillion range, right, glyphosate can cause a phenotypal transformation of a healthy epithelial cell into a cancerous one. And it goes with the dose does not make the poison. The lower the dose in concentration, particle size, and even frequency, if it's like, the higher the adverse effects. Because otherwise, the cell at a higher dose of glyphosate would go through programmed cell death or necrotic death, and it wouldn't create cancer. Instead, this will immortalize one of the cells in the trillions of your body to potentially take over the whole thing.
Mm.
And that's the thing about glyphosate is that and that's unfortunate, but that is the standard that the EPA, as a cheerleader, not so much a regulator of the industries, has set up over the years.
Well, it flies in the face of the natural order of things. I mean, and I think this is where it really has to come to as a worldview perspective, as people must take a step back and analyze, does this killing of, whether it is insecticide or whether it is killing of pain, like you mentioned, Sayer, does this align with my worldview and how I believe the body was either designed or how I believe it exists?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the Stoics, even before the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm, they talked about first do nothing.
I
Like that.
love it. Really?
Yeah, first do nothing. It was primum nihil fac. We
Awesome.
put that in the book, but
Wow.
let the body, let nature do what it was designed to do. Intervene only when life is truly at risk. Emergency care, and when somebody is truly very, very ill, and the cost benefit analysis outweighs the do nothing principle. But this is the idea of like how much intervention is really improving human health.
I mean, I love this because one of my most viral posts and articles was about doing good medicine, which is do nothing, and using watchful waiting and having confidence in your body, as someone who's naturally birthed, Leah, which men don't have the experience of outside of being there to support. That's just amazing. You say you have God or nature. Your confidence is based on faith in that infinitely intelligent, benefic fact. Like, you have a body, there's miracles happening, and I'm going to have confidence in that. And then when you go through it, you are the living example of it. You're living proof, right? But the moment you take even the smallest allopathic intervention, you have to give credit to that system, even when in many cases you're only healthy or not, you know, clearly harmed because of your body overcoming the unnecessary treatments, you know?
Mm.
So, wow, yeah, I think that that's profound. I'm really happy you brought that up because I didn't know how far back it goes. But it is more than don't just do no harm. It's do nothing. Like literally, like we have every single thing we need within our body. I mean, even breatharians and people who don't drink water and eat for literally months. It's been hospital validated that that's a possibility. I'm not advocating for that. You know, don't try that at home, but it's definitely something you can do. That's how perfect we are, you know, like our bodies are perfect. Stop messing with our bodies because it's all about compulsory medicine. The moment they can convince you that you need a diagnostic intervention or need to take some kind of quasi Eucharistic, you know, allopathic, you know, chemical, then they've made you realize you don't own your body. It's
Mhm.
essentially property, not yours, 'cause especially when they use fear, especially with the infectious disease model. Because, of course, if you don't do what they say for your body, you can infect the whole world. Like, that's communism. That's veiled
Mhm.
communism in a quasi medical, you know, sort of instrument. And that's what people woke up to, that this is the most devastating psychological operation that has ever been deployed against humanity in this disguise of medicine and the greater good and the health of the public.
And I'm wondering what you think about, I mean, since you mentioned compulsory medicine and how much of the human experience is being robbed from us, robbed of a breakthrough. And I think that's incredibly apparent in psychiatric care. Do you see
Yeah.
psychiatric care as one of maybe the top medical lies?
Yes. Well, it's so perfectly dovetails with the gaslighting that allopathy is founded upon, right? Which is that, you know, if you don't or succumb fully to the medical interventions, which poison you into a state of oblivion, and dependency and Stockholm syndrome, because you're being poisoned, or let's say you went in for a scan of your breast, you're healthy 40-year-old, and suddenly they tell you, oh, we found something suspicious. You have ductal carcinoma in situ, which is a benign calcification of the duct. Um, and then they say, well, they use fear. They're like, well, if we don't, you know, do a lumpectomy or mastectomy, you're going to die. You know, it's insane that you wouldn't do this treatment. But then only after about 1.5 million people lost their breasts in 2012 is when the National Cancer Institutes finally confirmed what many of us already knew and were reporting on, which is this is a benign condition. It's not cancer. And yet they never issued an apology. You know, they literally converted them into brand ambassadors, survivors who are out there marching for a cure. The many of them with secondary cancers because they make the cutoff rate 5 years, so they don't have to take into account the iatrogenic origin of secondary cancers from their treatments. Not to mention the psycho spiritual trauma of being misdiagnosed or what they call overdiagnosed and overtreated. And then they go ahead and they, you know, become, you know, unfortunately, unwitting ambassadors for this agenda. It's happened over and over again throughout medicine. I mean, I can give you so many examples. So, anyway, so the whole compulsory medical model is really more about control. It's what Foucault called biopolitics and also massification, which is you're dealing with billions of bodies on this planet. How do you control them? Ideology is diverse. How are you going to get everyone to be a communist or a capitalist? You can't do it. But you can convince everybody that they're these deadly invisible particles. You can invade countries over it. Oh, I'm sorry, Uganda, you have a new Ebola variant. We're going to just close down your country. And then we saw what they did with that. They used a COVID-19. They reclassified flu season, literally, like if you look at the statistics, into some new variant of so-called COVID. And if it's not that, they've, for how many years, convinced us that disease is primarily caused from these invisible genes in our body, protein coding genes, they thought, which is absurd because they don't account for anything. Like 23,000 protein coding genes. Earthworms have the same amount. There's 100,000 proteins in a single cell. You can't even account for the existence of a single cell with that information, much less the folding of one protein in that cell, which has to go through a near infinite degrees of freedom to even fold into its perfect state, which would take almost infinite information. which is what God and nature provides, not, some code inside of our nucleus that these priests with their white coats are going to tell us, they know about better than our own bodies. Like the whole thing is absurd. And it's like people have woken up to that.
Well, and that's the beautiful thing is we're done with these notions guarding the hen house. We're done with the fox guarding the hen house. And that's why we're here to guard the hen house. It's there's a new uprising of people who are ready to share the truth. But just this week, the American Psychiatry Association started coming after Secretary Kennedy. So what have you heard about that, and why the Psychiatry Association?
Yeah, it is a new, sort of like element of this operation, influence operation. There was a it's a vaccine lobbying group memo that was released in April that they claim is not theirs, but it just so clearly documents everything that's happened since it was discovered. From things like Bernie Sanders, writing op-eds in The Guardian, UK-based paper, right? Just like the Center for Countering Digital Hate, creating propaganda, basically calling for the ousting of a cabinet member, right, in his own government. Like, this is extremely, I'm not going to use the word treason, but some people have said that's treasonous behavior. I mean, who are you working for? I mean, give me a break, please. I mean, you know, essentially, what we're seeing is a very elaborate, orchestrated campaign to create a Black narrative, which is actually literally a Black ops, because CCDH's CEO in 2024, there was a leaked memo saying they were going to put a Black ops on RFK Jr. They were nervous about his effect on the election because at the time he was running. A Black ops is essentially an illegal operation, which could include anything. It could from, media placements to paramilitary intelligence assets being deployed. This is what they're doing to people that spoke up during the past few years, and they did not expect Bobby to ascend to the level of a cabinet member, certainly not for HHS. So they're desperate. I mean, the beehive has been kicked on so many levels that they are trying everything in their power to take Bobby out to these narratives. But essentially, the psychiatric foundations and organizations and practitioners, I think they realize that their game is up. They can't hide behind mantras that are empty, like safe and effective. If you claim to be part of the evidence-based medicine establishment, then use evidence. Where's the gold standard evidence for SSRIs, for example? Can anyone show me how they're ascertaining that through the monoamine hypothesis, serotonin deficiency causes depression? Like, are they cracking open the black box of the brain to measure serotonin levels, like in the infinite complexity of our neurobiology, which is really more interesting from an electromagnetic perspective than simple chemical diffusion and little molecules? I mean, that's a dark ages model of what makes us tick and how our soul functions. So, him calling out the very direct links with suicide, meaning like treatment resistant cases of people on SSRIs who actually are more suicidal or more likely to create violent acts against themselves or others, hence the link to shooting episodes. So yeah, they have every reason to be upset and afraid of Bobby's work, but I think it's actually a good sign, that they're being shaken awake by their own karma and their own denials of the obvious issues that we experience as the exposed populations, exposed to their propaganda, exposed to their synthetic patented chemicals that do not solve a problem that isn't, it's not, we don't have chemical imbalances outside of the chemicals that are poisoning us. And of course, one of the primary vectors is the psychiatric medications. They create a chemical imbalance where there never was one. That's their very nature. Take fluoxetine, which is Prozac. It's fluorine based. It's the same reason why we end fluoridation of the public through the water, because that has an extremely toxic effect on the nervous system, especially the pineal gland. In fact, there's very compelling evidence that it will contribute to calcifying the pineal gland, the neurobiological seat of the soul. it's not an accident, right, that all that was developed. In fact, Prozac was developed because of research into LSD and the discovery of the serotonergic system, and MK Ultra was involved in that research. So when you really look at the origin of psychiatry, which does have Nazi roots, there's absolutely, history there to be explored. It's really starting to come to light, and they're
Well,
responsible for their history and their actions.
well, it's, we sometimes I think we look at the history of psychiatry and acknowledge the dark history, but it's not just history. I mean, Global Wellness Forum has been covering an issue about ECT and how when these drugs that you're talking about fail, psychiatry, modern day psychiatry today, and the hospitals down the street are resorting to electrocuting the brain. So like what is this? This is actually happening. What is ECT?
I mean, it is no pun intended, but it is shocking. Most people you ask, okay, are they still using essentially electrocution as an intervention medically? Yeah, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, is a euphemism. It's similar too to the use of the word immunization in place of vaccination, implying somehow that there's always a therapeutic effect there. So electroconvulsive therapy delivers up to 450 volts of electricity directly into the brain, which is way higher than a fatal dose if you were to put it into the heart, for example. Or like take an industrial elevator. It uses, 200 to 400 volts of electricity. I mean, they're putting it directly into the brain, okay, with up to 900 milliamperes, which is an extremely high amount. And this is actually considered to be a safe and effective intervention based on present FDA status because it was grandfathered in as a loophole in 1976. So there have been many attempts to ban it. In fact, in 2018, after there was a real grassroots effort to really just take this off the table, it was downgraded actually to a class 2 or moderate risk for depression. So they actually made it even more acceptable. And now it's being deployed in children as young as 5 years of age. Okay, that's like the youngest documented age for what is essentially a torture device. The only thing that would even make it not torture is if you consented and you knew truly what the risks were. But they don't offer that because no one's telling the truth about it. In fact, before this interview, I went on Google to just see what would come up when I asked about ECT, and it says that it's using low amperage, which is insane. I mean, the amperage here is something like 450 tasers. Like it's an extremely high amount, and it's going into the brain. These are people that have actual conditions where they need support emotionally, or they have been eating seed oils and they've been poisoned their whole life, right, by who knows what, and they're going to use a shock treatment. Well, it's not even a treatment. Again, they're going to use a form of electrocution to
Mm.
try to propose that that's going to benefit the patient. And so this is being deployed at scale. There's billions of dollars actually being made in the United States alone. The two manufacturers of the device, Mecta and Somatics, they actually export the device to China, which has been subject to massive, reprimand because they're using the devices for torture. Literally, that's literally what they're using it for with Falun Gong practitioners. So again, it is a torture device. It was devised, in the 30s by two Italian, I won't even call them scientists, honestly, because of what they were using it for, essentially trying to propose it as a solution, again, for people with schizophrenia. I mean, if you think about it, if you are someone with emotional disturbances and you're diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder and you're being electrocuted in your brain, of course you're going to come out of that being more, more docile potentially, and just having no memory, which by the way doesn't come back. Okay, so much of this is permanent brain damage. Yeah, then you're going to fit into society better, right? Because you're just barely there. It's basically, they used to talk about chemical lobotomies, but this is a electrocution type lobotomy occurring. So when I looked into it, I was just shocked. In fact, what I like to do is do a literature review. So I went on PubMed.gov, and we have almost 300 studies now covering the effects of this procedure across 66 different potential adverse effects. And by the way, one of the adverse effects is it's fatal. And as you know, when you ask medical professionals or you talk to the psychiatry organizations or the individuals participating in this, they'll say it's safe and effective. I mean, where did we hear that before?
Well, and it's probably more common than what we've been let on to believe, right? How common is ECT? Do you know? Like how much is it being utilized in the United States?
I mean, it is actually quite common. In fact, we know that according to statistics from our own government, like veterans, okay, there's about 2,500 veterans who are being electrocuted basically through this procedure. It's about 20, I'd say about $23 million so far. That's been, sort of through the VA alone. But this is being, offered in sort of more of a private model, and people can get charged over, $2,000 per treatment, so to speak. I really shouldn't use the word treatment. So, basically, we think that the scale at which this is happening is 6 to 12 million procedures each year, and it's generating between 12 to 30 billion dollars annually. And there are only two manufacturers, literally. Okay, so they have been sued. They are definitely in a precarious situation because it's very hard to justify that this is a therapeutic device. So there are many victims of ECT. Many of them, have given testimony. And so the challenge is that because the FDA at present considers it a class 2 device, because it was grandfathered in, it's still being covered, by certain sort of medical insurance plans and then government insurance. So it's a human rights issue that's profound. For instance, you could have a daughter who's suffering from PMS, and that is absolutely one of the uses that it's being deployed against, even though it's not officially within the class 2 rating. It's a class 3 application. It's sort of like off label. But can you imagine your 13-year-old who's suffering from PMS that maybe needs just a warm bath with Epsom salt and a little more attention, right? Maybe some comfort foods, snuggle up on the couch with a stuffed animal. That's what she needs. But then she's being pulled into a system that considers this necessary and safe and effective. And it's just so outrageous, but it is such an indication of how far we've allowed the medical system to take over, not just like our bodies, but our minds. And that's essentially what this is about. If we allow this to proceed, we will allow anything. In fact, those who have experienced this technology, they describe it as medical rape. And that is essentially what this is. Your soul is being raped by this technology. Anyone who looks at the evidence, they look at and talk to victims, which I have, you will find that they are irreparably harmed from this. And it is just absolutely, it's unconscionable. So that's one reason, Global Wellness Forum focuses on a lot of different advocacies, as you know, because you're incredible partners. And so that goes from geoengineering. Obviously, we can't have Maha anything if our entire planet is being poisoned, okay? Especially in the US, where you can clearly see the rain, the air, the soil, completely poisoned with things like nanometals. Where are they coming from? Well, a lot of it has to do with geoengineering. A lot of it has to do with fuel containing nanometals. There are other, there's aluminum used in chaff, for military. There are a lot of things going on here. And then we care a heck of a lot about informed consent. That's why we love SHF so much and are just blown away by the success of your organization. So, but this one, when I look deeper into it, the biggest shock to me was that people just simply don't even know that it's still going on. Because during the Nazi era of psychiatry, right, where a lot of modern psychology was innovated, again, the connection with MK Ultra goes back to Project Paperclip and Nazi scientists getting through the Nuremberg trials and being basically placed in positions of power within the scientific, medical, and technology sectors here in the US, ostensibly because, we were concerned about national security. We needed the best we could, right? We didn't care about what they did. Well, there was a Nazi psychiatrist that took essentially the same device that's being used today, but go back in time, and he modified it as an execution device. And that's actually what it is believed China has been doing as well. Because once you have psychiatry as an extrajudicial, extra legal mechanism to take control of someone, suspend their rights, which again, we all know what that means now because the whole world experienced it. But just consider if a family member that maybe doesn't like you or a partner doesn't like you and they start to try to use psychiatry as a way to essentially isolate you, gaslight you, and then force a procedure on you like this because your consent is suspended, or they deprive you of the information you need to make an informed choice. Well, this is the problem, is the dark history of psychiatry around these devices is still being applied to literally millions of people around the world are subject to this. So, we have a campaign that we feel will make it very easy for people to contact their elected officials and start to push for awareness on why this needs to. Okay, we're saying this. If it's safe and effective, use gold standard science, just like Bobby's been asking for everything else. And that will force a review on how it was grandfathered in. And if it's not safe and effective, then absolutely it should be banned.
Absolutely. I mean, that's when it's always worth the effort to stop a process that is compulsory. When you look at the most vulnerable members of our population that are either being given this as a pseudo choice or forced into it because they're institutionalized. And so we'll put the link to the call to action, the show notes from Global Wellness Forum, because people want dark psychiatry to end. We want to be told the truth about how our loved ones can thrive, about what's going on with their health and their well-being. And so, absolutely, I know that our time is coming close, but if you could pick two things for the world to know the truth about, what would they be? Out of all of your
Yeah.
advocacies, is it geoengineering? Is it is it the ones we've already talked about?
Well, it's a really good question. I would say for now, this ECT is the one that I think will unravel the entire, sort of like multi-layered psychological operation, which is allopathic medicine's dark side. Now, allopathy has incredible applications, life-saving applications in emergency medicine. And when it's reformed to integrate natural medicine, the diagnostic capacities, especially with AI, and some of the technologies that will emerge are unimaginably beautiful. So I am not saying that we can't offer a path, a bridge forward with both allopathic doctors and even psychiatrists, because there are good ones, as you know, that are actually using nutrition, that are helping people taper off. And, I think that for me, this is the number one advocacy that I have right now. However, the other thing that I really want people to know about is what we discussed, which is that there is nothing that you can ever experience, right, in your body that cannot be undone or reversed, and that the ultimate doctor is, of course, your own body, your own soul. And that's as old as time itself. Like, that's how we got here as a species when we were, in called the Garden of Eden, or struggling, through the last Younger Dryas post-meteor event with nothing. We just had our bodies, and our minds. And we could very easily go back to that place, in terms of the grid collapsing. Like, we have to learn how to really redevelop that primal sacred relationship with self and other. And then that's the basis for how we move forward without, yes, this multi-trillion dollar medical, military, media conglomerate that is the primary government, the primary governing body on this planet is the quasi-religious, cult-like connection people have with their pharmaceuticals, that daily, if you're participating in that system, or you're getting poisoned by the chemical industry, And then you have symptoms that then you go to the chemical industry at the higher octave, which is the pharmaceutical industry, which has the patented chemicals they say that you need to take, otherwise you're going to die, when in fact your poisoning is behind most of the illness. This like mega cycle of gaslighting, I can tell you that we just broke through that as a species because of what they chose to do with the trump card of you're all going to die because of COVID. Like they went way, way farther than they should have with that. And now
Hmm.
people are waking up. So what they need to learn, of course, I know you guys have an incredible book coming out too, which is going to be amazing because it goes to the heart of how you recover that awareness and the tools you need to implement these healthy lifestyles. That's what Regenerate is about as well. So many of us who've gone through the fire on this are also providing solutions that are grounded in ancestral and even religious scriptures, because that's where the wisdom of the ancients resides. It's
Hmm.
always been there, you know. So we're just remembering how to be healthy again, but it's really in our bodies and souls anyway. So you don't even need a book for that, right?
Hmm. That's right. There's intuition, there's innate, there's built-in mechanisms that are already ingrained within our DNA. And I remember learning some of that when we did an event together in I think it's 2013 in Naples, and just hearing you talk. It was at that church there in Naples. You and Joelle were doing, I think it was a event on cancer. And I just remember sitting there thinking, this guy is a walking encyclopedia of natural health.
Thanks.
And you've been teaching this for such a long time, and I'd love for more people to follow your work moving into the future. So, how can people follow your work?
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I remember that. That was great. It was a church, which is, you know what, fundamentally, this is an evangelical movement, right? It's the gospel, the good news. You heal, you feel touched by that creative, benefic force, and you want to share it. And that's amazing. Versus, oh my God, there's a new particle that's going to kill us, and that's what they want us to share. It's like we want to share love and faith and confidence in our humanity and what's good about being alive, right? And that's it, you know. But so anyway, Substack, so Sayer G, you can look me up on Substack, is where I basically do my daily real-time reporting. But we have our Green Med Info newsletter. That's greenmedinfo.com/newsletter. And then I'm on social. They tried deplatforming me. I lost 2 million fans within about 6 months in 2021. But at this point, I've been replatformed entirely because of, thankfully, a lot of the platforms, really realizing that what they were doing was actually quite evil, and there are legal consequences to them continuing to do that to people to suppress their free speech. So, and of course, SHF is at the forefront of that, and I have a lawsuit as well with 5 other plaintiffs in the Disinfo Dozen here in Florida. So it's great, to be alive and to know you guys, and yeah, just really honored to be on your show today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sarah. That's it's been great to co-mission alongside you for so many years, and we're really thankful for your voice and all that you've done to further humanity. Really, is what it comes down to. So, thank you.
Thank you. Same.